The scream cut through the morning like a blade. Agnes Rotich fell hard onto the cold stone of the mansion courtyard, her hands flying instinctively to her swollen belly. Blood streaked her faded dress as the wealthy woman standing over her raised her hand again, this time without hesitation. Servants froze in terror, while insults rained down each word sharper than the last. Agnes begged not for herself but for the unborn child, kicking desperately inside her womb. "This baby is a disgrace," the mistress spat, ordering the punishment to continue. No one dared to move, no one dared to speak, and no one imagined the truth that the child being beaten along with its mother carried the same blood as the woman who called it filth. When the final blow came, everything changed, forever. Before we continue, where are you watching from today, and what time is it there? If stories of justice, healing, and hidden truths move your heart, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us. Agnes Rotich had learned the meaning of hunger before she learned how to dream. She was born in a small rural village in western Kenya, where red earth stained bare feet and the days were measured by the sun rather than clocks. Her parents were subsistence farmers who worked borrowed land, waking before dawn and returning home only when darkness swallowed the fields. They were gentle people, the kind who shared what little they had, even when sharing meant sleeping with empty stomachs. Agnes was their only child. When she was 9, her father died suddenly from an untreated infection. The nearest clinic was miles away, and by the time help came, it was too late. Her mother tried to survive alone, but grief and exhaustion wore her down. 2 years later, she followed her husband into the grave, leaving Agnes behind with nothing but a small bundle of clothes and a silence that felt heavier than stone. No relatives came forward. No neighbors could afford another mouth to feed. At 11 years old, Agnes became invisible. She moved between distant family friends, working for food, sleeping on floors, learning quickly that questions were dangerous and gratitude was her only shield. School became a memory she carried quietly inside her, like a photograph she dared not look at too often. By 15, she knew that if she stayed in the village, she would disappear. Completely married off, worked into the ground, or forgotten. So she left. The bus to Nairobi was crowded and loud, filled with people chasing opportunity or running from despair. Agnes sat pressed between strangers, clutching a small bag and the address of a woman someone said might need help in her home. She did not know Nairobi. She did not know what waited for her. But she knew staying behind meant slow erasure. In the city, survival took a different shape. Agnes worked as a house helper from dawn until late night, scrubbing floors, washing clothes, cooking meals she was rarely allowed to taste. She moved from house to house, each employer promising fair treatment and delivering the same quiet cruelty. Some shouted, some ignored her completely. Others pretended kindness while paying her late or not at all. She learned to lower her eyes when spoken to. She learned to say yes even when she wanted to cry. She learned that dignity for someone like her was something you protected silently. When she was hired at Mrs. Margaret Whitmore's mansion, Agnes believed briefly that her life might finally steady itself. The house was enormous, perched behind tall iron gates in one of Nairobi's wealthiest neighborhoods. Marble floors reflected light like water. The air smelled of imported flowers and expensive polish. Agnes was given a small room behind the kitchen, barely large enough for a mattress and a wooden stool, but to her it felt like safety. Mrs. Whitmore was strict, but she paid on time. She did not shout often. She liked order. Agnes did her work flawlessly. She spoke little, moved quietly, and followed every rule. Mama Wanjiku, the older housekeeper, noticed her discipline and sometimes slipped her extra food when no one was watching. Those small kindnesses became Agnes's anchors. For the first time in years, she slept without fear. It was during one of her rare evenings off that everything changed. Agnes had been sent to the market to buy supplies. On her way back, as the sun darkened the sky and rain clouds gathered, 2 men cornered her in a narrow street. They grabbed her bag, shoved her hard, and ran. She fell onto the wet pavement, shaking, bruised, and alone. That was when a stranger appeared. He offered his jacket without asking questions. He helped her to her feet and guided her away from the street as rain poured down. They took shelter in an abandoned structure, nearby water dripping through cracks in the roof. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then slowly, words came. They talked about loneliness, about disappointment, about the quiet exhaustion of carrying life alone. He did not ask her where she worked. She did not ask his name. That night was not planned. It was not reckless passion or careless desire. It was two broken souls clinging briefly to warmth in a cold world. When the rain stopped, they parted without promises. Agnes never saw him again. Weeks later, her body began to change. At first, she told herself it was stress, hunger, fatigue. But deep inside, she knew. When the truth could no longer be denied, panic wrapped itself around her chest like a tightening rope. A child. She was a housemaid with no family, no savings, and no protection. The father was a stranger whose face haunted her dreams, but whose name she did not know. In Mrs. Whitmore's house, pregnancy was unforgivable. It meant disgrace. It meant dismissal. It meant being thrown back into the streets. Agnes chose silence. She tied her uniforms looser. She avoided mirrors. She worked harder, hoping effort might erase reality. Mama Wanjiku noticed the change, the way Agnes grew pale, the way she sometimes paused to steady her breath. One evening, she whispered gently, "My child hiding will not save you forever." Agnes only shook her head. "If I speak," she said softly, "I lose everything." As months passed, the secret became heavier. Her belly rounded, her steps slowed. The other servants began to whisper. Eyes lingered too long. Questions floated in the air, unspoken but sharp. Mrs. Margaret Whitmore noticed. She watched Agnes with narrowed eyes, counting movements, reading signs. Suspicion grew like a storm behind her composed expression. To her, order was sacred, and disorder, especially from someone she considered beneath her, was an insult. Agnes felt it before it came. The tension, the watchful silence, the sense that the walls were closing in. Every night she lay on her narrow mattress, one hand resting on her growing belly, whispering apologies to the life inside her. "I don't know how to protect you," she murmured, "but I will try." She did not know that her silence was about to be shattered. She did not know that the house she believed was her refuge would soon become a place of violence. And she did not know that the child she carried, so vulnerable, so unwanted, was tied by blood to the very family that would try to destroy her. Margaret Whitmore did not believe cruelty was cruelty. She believed it was discipline. From the outside, her life looked like a portrait of success, carefully framed and polished. She lived in one of Nairobi's most exclusive neighborhoods, hosted charity luncheons, attended by politicians and diplomats, and sat on boards that shaped business and influence across the city. Newspapers called her formidable. Society magazines called her elegant. People who wanted favors called her madam. Very few people dared to call her wrong. Margaret had not always been rich. She came from a modest background herself, though she rarely acknowledged it. As a young woman, she had learned early that softness invited hunger, and that survival belonged to those who controlled the room. When she married Edward Whitmore, a powerful businessman with international connections, she stepped fully into a world where appearances were currency and weakness was unforgivable. Edward taught her that respect was taken, not given. Margaret perfected the lesson. Their marriage was built on ambition, more than affection. They entertained, lavishly, traveled widely, and built an empire that commanded admiration. But behind closed doors, warmth was scarce. Love in that house was conditional, earned through obedience and success. When Simon was born, Margaret believed motherhood would soften her. It did not. She loved her son fiercely, but her love was sharp-edged. From the time Simon could walk, she corrected him constantly. his posture, his speech, his friends. Excellence was not a goal, it was a requirement. Failure was not a lesson, it was a threat. Simon grew up surrounded by luxury but starved of gentleness. Margaret justified everything she did in the name of preparation. "The world is cruel," she would say. "If I am not hard on you, someone else will be harder." Edward rarely intervened. He was often away, and when he was home, he preferred silence to confrontation. Simon learned early that the safest way to survive the household was distance. Then, without warning, Edward died of a heart attack during a business trip. Margaret's grief was real, but it was private, buried beneath control. She did not collapse. She did not retreat. Instead, she tightened her grip on everything Edward left behind: the companies, the staff, the reputation. She became colder, sharper, more exacting than ever. The house changed after Edward's death. Rules multiplied, smiles disappeared. Mistakes were punished swiftly. Servants came and went, unable to endure the pressure of living under Margaret's gaze. To her, turnover was proof of her standards, not her severity. People were replaceable, order was not. Simon, already strained, found the house unbearable. He challenged her openly for the first time in his early 20s after she fired a long-serving employee for a minor mistake. "You didn't even listen," he said. "You don't see people." Margaret's response was immediate and devastating. "People who fail deserve consequences," she said coldly. "If you can't understand that, you are not ready to inherit anything." That argument was the beginning of the end. Simon left Nairobi soon after taking a position abroad and cutting contact to the bare minimum. Margaret told herself he would return when he matured, when he realized the world rewarded strength, not sentiment. Years passed. She filled the silence with work, charity events, and social obligations. In public, she smiled. In private, she ruled her household with absolute authority. Every servant knew the rules. Every movement was monitored. Gratitude was expected, not earned. When Agnes Rotich arrived at the mansion, Margaret barely noticed her at first. Another young woman from the countryside, quiet, thin, properly obedient. Margaret approved of obedience. She did not care for stories or backgrounds. To her, servants existed to fulfill functions not to be understood. Agnes worked efficiently and never complained. That earned her a fragile tolerance. But tolerance was not kindness. Margaret noticed everything. The way Agnes walked, the way she breathed, the way she sometimes paused, hand resting briefly on her lower back. Margaret had lived long enough to recognize patterns, and patterns to her meant disruption. She began watching Agnes more closely. In Margaret's world, disorder always had a cause and a culprit. Pregnancy in her house was not merely inappropriate, it was an insult. It suggested carelessness, immorality, a failure of control. Worse, it suggested shame. Margaret's fear was not scandal alone. It was contamination, the idea that something messy, something uncontrolled, could exist under her roof. The mansion was a symbol. It had to remain pure, orderly, superior. When whispers reached her ears, she did not confront Agnes immediately. She waited. Margaret believed power was most effective when delayed. Letting fear grow was part of discipline. She watched Agnes struggle to hide her body. She saw the tension in her movements, the way her eyes avoided contact. In her mind, guilt was already proven. Margaret did not consider the possibility of compassion. In her experience, compassion weakened authority. It invited chaos, and chaos, once allowed, spread. She thought of Simon, distant, defiant, gone. She told herself that disorder always began with softness. By the time Margaret decided to act, her judgment was fixed. To her, Agnes was no longer a person. She was a problem, and problems, Margaret Whitmore believed, had to be dealt with publicly, so others would learn. As she prepared to summon Agnes, she felt no hesitation, only resolve. She did not know that the child she despised represented not disorder, but connection. She did not know that the blood she was so determined to erase was her own, and she did not know that her obsession with control was about to cost her the very thing she claimed to protect her family. Simon and Becky learned how to leave long before he ever walked out the gate. As a child, he learned it in silence by retreating inward when his mother's voice sharpened, by swallowing questions that were never welcome, by recognizing that affection in his home came with conditions he could never fully meet. The mansion was large, but somehow it always felt airless, as if every room demanded obedience before it offered shelter. Margaret Whitmore loved her son. Of that Simon never truly doubted, but love in her hands was rigid and unyielding. It was measured in expectations, not understanding. Praise was rare, correction was constant. Simon grew up surrounded by wealth, yet painfully aware that comfort was not the same as safety. He excelled in school because excellence was demanded, not encouraged. He learned to speak carefully, to control his emotions, to hide disappointment behind polite restraint. When he questioned rules or defended a servant who had been treated harshly, Margaret's response was always the same. "You are too soft," she would say. "The world will eat you alive." Simon watched servants disappear overnight, dismissed without explanation, replaced without acknowledgement. He watched fear settle into the eyes of people who lived and worked under his mother's authority. And slowly, quietly, he began to understand that the order Margaret worshipped was built on silence. The breaking point came when Simon was 23. A driver who had worked for the family for over a decade made a mistake, an innocent one. A missed appointment, a misunderstanding. Margaret fired him on the spot, refusing to hear explanations. Simon intervened, his voice shaking, not with anger, but disbelief. "He has children," Simon said. "At least let him explain." Margaret's face hardened. "If you defend incompetence," she replied coldly, "you encourage it." That night, Simon packed his bags. He left Nairobi without a dramatic goodbye. No shouting, no slammed doors, only a brief note left on his desk, carefully worded, respectful, restrained. "I need to find out who I am without fear." Margaret read the note once and folded it neatly. She told herself his departure was temporary. A phase, a test of will she fully expected to win. But Simon did not come back. He moved abroad, building a career far from his mother's shadow. He worked hard not to prove himself to Margaret, but to himself. He founded companies that valued transparency and fairness, surrounded himself with people who challenged him honestly. Over time, his name became known in business circles, not as Margaret Whitmore's son, but as Simon Mbeki, competent, ethical, quietly formidable. He kept his life private. Relationships were few and carefully chosen. He avoided long attachments, wary of repeating patterns he had grown up with. He carried a constant sense of restlessness, as if he were always passing through, rather than settling. Yet no matter how far he traveled, Nairobi never fully released him. He followed news from home more than he admitted. He checked updates about his mother's businesses, her public appearances, her carefully maintained image. He did not call often, but he never completely severed the thread. Some part of him still hoped for reconciliation, or at least understanding. Margaret interpreted his distance as ingratitude. To her, Simon's success was proof that her methods had worked. His absence was a childish protest she believed time would correct. She spoke of him with pride in public and bitterness in private, telling herself that one day he would return humbled, ready to accept her authority once more. Years passed in this uneasy stalemate. Then one evening, thousands of kilometers away, Simon's phone vibrated with a notification he did not expect. A headline flashed across his screen. "Wealthy Nairobi socialite accused of beating pregnant housemaid." Simon frowned, curiosity turning quickly into concern. He tapped the link. The article described a woman, beaten in the courtyard of a luxury home, a pregnant domestic worker, witnesses too afraid to intervene, an ambulance called too late. The name of the homeowner was not printed, but the description was unmistakable. Simon felt a tightening in his chest. He scrolled through comments. Anger, outrage, disbelief. Someone had posted a blurry photo taken from behind a gate. The image was poor quality, but the setting was familiar. Too familiar. His mother's house. At first, Simon told himself it could not be true. Sensational headlines often exaggerated. Margaret was harsh, yes, but violent toward a pregnant woman. Then he remembered the driver, the housemaid dismissed without severance, the fear he had seen so many times before. The unease grew heavier. Simon closed his laptop and tried to sleep, but his mind refused to rest. The article replayed itself behind his eyes, accompanied by memories he had spent years trying to distance himself from. By morning, he had made a decision. He booked the earliest flight to Nairobi. This time he was not returning as a son seeking approval. He was returning as a man ready to confront consequences. On the plane, Simon tried to prepare himself for what he might find. He told himself he would be calm, rational. He would assess the situation, protect the family name if necessary, and ensure the matter was resolved quietly. That was his plan. But beneath the controlled surface, something else stirred an unease he could not explain. The image of the pregnant woman lingered in his thoughts, her face indistinct, yet strangely persistent. There was something about the story that felt personal, though he could not say why. As the plane descended toward Nairobi, Simon stared out the window at the city below. The familiar landscape filled him with conflicting emotions, nostalgia, resentment, longing. He did not yet know that the woman lying in a public hospital bed was not a stranger to his past. He did not know that the life growing inside her carried his blood, and he did not know that this return home would force him to confront not only his mother's actions, but his own silence. The distance he had maintained for years was about to collapse, and when it did, nothing would remain untouched. The night that changed Agnes Rotich's life began like any other, quiet, exhausting and ordinary. She had been sent to the market late that afternoon, long after the sun had begun to tilt toward the horizon. Mrs. Margaret Whitmore disliked excuses, and the list of items Agnes carried was long. By the time she finished bargaining with vendors and packing everything into worn cloth bags, the sky had darkened, heavy clouds gathering with a promise that felt almost threatening. Agnes walked quickly, her sandals slapping against the pavement, her shoulders hunched beneath the weight she carried. The road leading back to the servants' quarters cut through a poorly lit stretch of the city, narrow, uneven, and often avoided after sunset. She knew the risk, but refusing was not an option. The rain came suddenly. One moment the air was thick and still, the next it exploded with sound. Water poured from the sky, soaking her dress within seconds. She tried to shield the bags beneath her arms, her breath quickening as thunder cracked overhead. That was when she heard footsteps behind her. At first she told herself it was nothing. Nairobi never truly slept. But the sound grew faster, closer. Before she could turn, a hand grabbed her shoulder, wrenching her backward. Another tore the bags from her arms. Agnes cried out, losing her balance as she hit the wet ground, hard pain flashing through her side. The men didn't speak. They ran. Agnes lay there, stunned, rain blurring her vision, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the storm. Her body trembled, not just from fear, but from the sudden understanding of how fragile she was. Alone, exposed, disposable. She struggled to her knees, fighting tears, when a voice cut through the rain. "Are you hurt?" Agnes looked up, startled. A man stood a few steps away, his clothes already soaked, his posture cautious but steady. He did not touch her immediately. He did not demand answers. He simply waited, giving her space she was not used to being offered. I think so," she said, her voice barely audible. He approached slowly and held out his jacket. "Take this. You're shaking." She hesitated, then accepted it with trembling hands. The fabric was warm, heavy, carrying the faint scent of soap and rain. He helped her stand, careful not to overwhelm her, and guided her away from the open street as the downpour intensified. They found shelter in the shell of an unfinished building. Nearby bare walls, exposed beams, a roof that leaked, but still offered some protection. Water pooled on the floor, reflecting the flicker of distant streetlights. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Agnes hugged the jacket tightly around herself, trying to slow her breathing. She expected questions: where she lived, who she was, why she was alone. Instead, the man leaned against the wall a short distance away. His gaze focused not on her but on the rain outside. "I'm sorry that happened," he said quietly. "You didn't deserve it." No one had ever said that to her before. Something in his voice, steady, unassuming, broke through the wall Agnes had built around herself. Words spilled out before she could stop them. She told him about the mansion, about the long days, about how small her life felt, even when she worked harder than anyone else. He listened without interruption. When she finished, embarrassed by her own honesty, he nodded slowly. "Sometimes," he said, "people confuse power with worth. They're not the same." Agnes studied him in the dim light. He didn't look like the men she served, no arrogance, no impatience. There was a weariness in his eyes that mirrored her own, as if he too carried a quiet burden. They spoke, until the rain softened into mist. He told her he was passing through Nairobi, taking time away from expectations he no longer wanted to carry. He did not say his name. She did not ask. In that moment, labels felt unnecessary. They were simply two people, standing in the same fragile space, seeking warmth against the cold. When the rain finally stopped, the world outside felt strangely altered, cleaner, quieter. He offered to walk her part of the way. At the edge of the street, near her employer's neighborhood, they stopped. Agnes handed him back his jacket, reluctance tightening her chest. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." He smiled softly. "Take care of yourself." They parted without promises. Agnes watched him disappear into the night, unaware that she would never see him again. Weeks passed and life resumed its familiar rhythm. Agnes returned to her routines, burying the memory of that night beneath work and exhaustion. But something had shifted. A quiet awareness lingered of being seen even briefly as human. Then her body began to change. At first, she dismissed the signs. Fatigue was nothing new. Nausea could be hunger. But as days turned into weeks, the truth pressed itself forward with growing insistence. Agnes was pregnant. The realization struck her with equal parts fear and disbelief. She locked herself in the small bathroom behind the kitchen, staring at her reflection, as if it belonged to someone else. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against her stomach, searching for answers that would not come. The man from the rain had been gentle, respectful. He had not taken from her. Yet the result was the same, a life forming inside her, one that the world would not forgive her for carrying. She did the calculations in her head over and over again. There was no name she could give, no address, no protection. Mrs. Margaret Whitmore would not tolerate this, not under her roof. Agnes made a decision, born of fear. She would hide it. She adjusted her uniforms. She avoided close contact. She worked longer hours, hoping effort might buy silence. Each morning she woke with a mix of dread and determination, promising herself she would survive one more day. Mama Wanjiku noticed first. "You are losing weight in your face," the older woman whispered one evening as they folded laundry. "But your body is changing." Agnes froze. Mama Wanjiku's eyes softened. "Child," she said gently, "you don't have to be afraid of me." Tears burned behind Agnes's eyes, but she shook her head. Please, she whispered. If anyone knows, I am finished. Mama Wanjiku sighed, her own face etched with memories of survival. Secrets grow heavier with time, she said. Be careful. As months passed, the secret did grow heavier physically and emotionally. Agnes felt the baby move for the first time late one night, a flutter that stole her breath. She pressed a hand to her belly, fear giving way to something dangerously close to love. I will protect you, she whispered. Somehow. She did not know how. What she did know was that Mrs. Margaret Whitmore had begun to watch her. The glances lingered longer. Instructions became sharper. The air in the mansion grew tight with suspicion. Agnes felt the shift in power before it became visible, the way animals sense a storm before the sky darkens. The refuge she had believed in was crumbling. And the night, that once felt like a brief miracle, was about to demand its price. Agnes could no longer pretend her body belonged only to her. Each morning she woke earlier than before, moving carefully as she dressed in the dim light of the servants' corridor. Her uniforms, once loose, now clung stubbornly to her waist. She tied her apron higher. She bent less. She avoided sudden movements that might draw attention. Still, the change was unmistakable. Pregnancy had a way of announcing itself, no matter how quietly one begged it not to. The first whispers came from the kitchen. Two younger maids paused mid-conversation when Agnes entered, their eyes dropping quickly to the floor, then flicking back up to her stomach. A gardener stared a second too long as she passed the courtyard. Laughter stopped abruptly whenever she approached. Agnes felt the weight of those looks like hands pressing against her back. Mama Wanjiku noticed the tension tightening around the house. She had worked in wealthy homes for more than 3 decades and recognized the signs. Secrets did not stay buried in places ruled by fear. They fermented. One afternoon, as Agnes scrubbed pots behind the kitchen, Mama Wanjiku joined her, her movements slow and deliberate. She waited until no one else was nearby before speaking. "You cannot keep this hidden much longer," she said softly. Agnes's hands trembled in the water. "If Madam knows," she whispered, "she will throw me out. Or worse." Mama Wanjiku's eyes darkened with memory. "I have seen worse than dismissal," she said. "That is why I am afraid for you." Agnes swallowed hard. "I don't have anywhere to go." Mama Wanjiku reached out and squeezed her arm gently. "Then you must be careful. This house does not forgive what it does not control." Those words echoed in Agnes's mind, long after Mama Wanjiku walked away. Margaret Whitmore's suspicion had sharpened into something deliberate. At first it was small things. Agnes was reassigned to heavier tasks, watched closely under the pretense of efficiency. Margaret corrected her more frequently, her voice crisp and cutting, her gaze lingering on Agnes's midsection with thinly veiled disdain. Agnes tried to work through the fatigue, ignoring the dull ache in her lower back, the waves of nausea that came and went without warning. She told herself she could endure anything if it meant protecting the child growing inside her. But Margaret did not believe in endurance. She believed in exposure. One morning, as Agnes bent to mop the hallway outside the master bedroom, Margaret emerged impeccably dressed, her presence commanding immediate stillness. She stopped abruptly when she saw Agnes, her eyes narrowing. "Stand up," Margaret said. Agnes froze for half a second before obeying. As she straightened, the apron slipped slightly, revealing the curve she had worked so hard to conceal. The silence that followed felt endless. Margaret did not shout. She did not strike. Her expression hardened into something colder, something far more dangerous. "How long?" she asked quietly. Agnes's mouth went dry. Madame Margaret stepped closer, inspecting her like a flaw in expensive fabric. "How long have you been hiding?" This Agnes lowered her eyes. "I was going to tell you," when Margaret snapped. Agnes had no answer. Margaret straightened, smoothing her sleeve. "Finish your work," she said. "We will talk later." Later, that single word lodged in Agnes's chest like a stone. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Agnes moved mechanically, her thoughts racing ahead to the moment she could no longer delay. She knew what later meant in that house. It meant witnesses. It meant judgment. By evening, the entire staff seemed to sense it. Mama Wanjiku tried to catch Agnes's eye across the dining room, but Margaret was already watching. The servants were ordered to remain in the main hall after dinner, an unusual command that set nerves on edge. Agnes stood at the back, her heart pounding. Margaret entered last, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She did not sit. She did not smile. "There are rules in this house," she began, her voice calm but lethal. "Rules that ensure order, respect, and decency." Her gaze fixed on Agnes. When those rules are broken, there are consequences. Agnes felt the room tilt. She took a step forward, her voice shaking. "Madam, please. I only asked to keep my job until Silence Margaret cut in." She gestured toward Agnes's stomach. "Who is the father?" The question hung in the air, heavy and invasive. Agnes shook her head slowly. "I cannot say." A murmur rippled through the room. Margaret's eyes flashed. "You will say." Agnes lifted her chin slightly, tears burning. "He does not belong to this house. He did not harm me. Please." Margaret laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "Do not insult me with lies," she said. "Girls like you never keep such secrets without reason." Agnes felt her knees weaken. She pressed a hand to her belly instinctively. Margaret took a step closer. "You think I will allow my home to be polluted by immorality?" she continued. "You think I will shelter disgrace? I am not asking for shelter," Agnes whispered. "Only mercy." The word seemed to offend Margaret more than anything else. "Mercy," she repeated slowly. "Mercy is earned." She turned to the others. "Let this be a lesson," she said. "Disobedience brings shame to everyone." Mama Wanjiku moved instinctively, stepping forward. "Madam," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "She is with child. She needs." Margaret's hand came up sharply. "Enough," she snapped. "You will not lecture me in my own house." The room fell into stunned silence. Agnes felt fear coil tightly around her spine. She understood now that this was not about rules or order. This was about power. And power, once threatened, demanded spectacle. Margaret's eyes never left Agnes as she spoke the words that would change everything. "You will be punished," she said, "so that no one ever mistakes weakness for permission again." Agnes opened her mouth to beg, to plead for the life inside her, but the words caught in her throat. The servants' faces blurred together, a wall of fear and helplessness. Somewhere deep inside, the baby shifted. Agnes wrapped her arms protectively around her stomach, her heart hammering as realization crashed over her. There would be no reasoning, there would be no compassion, and there would be no escape. Not tonight. As Margaret turned away to give her orders, Agnes felt the last fragile illusion of safety crumble. The house she had believed would shelter her had already decided her fate. And the child she carried, innocent, unseen, unheard, was about to suffer for a secret. The world refused to forgive. The summons came just after sunrise. Agnes had barely slept. The night pressed heavily against her chest, every sound in the servants' corridor sharp and menacing. She lay awake with one hand on her belly, counting breaths, whispering prayers she was no longer sure anyone heard. When footsteps stopped outside her door, her body stiffened before the knock even came. "Madam wants you in the living room," a houseboy said quietly, eyes lowered. Agnes nodded. Her legs felt weak as she stood, as though the floor itself had shifted beneath her. She smoothed her dress with trembling hands, though she knew no amount of neatness could protect her now. The living room was already full. All the servants stood in a rigid line along the wall. Maids, gardeners, drivers, faces tight with fear. Eyes darting nervously. No one spoke, No one dared to move. The curtains were drawn back, allowing the morning light to flood the space, bright and unforgiving. Mrs. Margaret Whitmore sat in her high-backed chair like a judge on a throne. She wore a tailored cream suit, immaculate and severe. A teacup rested untouched beside her. When Agnes entered, Margaret did not look up immediately. She waited, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of anticipation do its work. "Come forward," she said at last. Agnes obeyed, each step echoing too loudly in her ears. She stopped several feet away, her head bowed, her heart pounding against her ribs. Margaret lifted her gaze slowly. "Look at me," she ordered. Agnes raised her eyes. Her vision blurred, but she held the woman's gaze, drawing strength from the steady rhythm inside her belly. Margaret's lips tightened. "You have shamed this house," she said flatly. Agnes swallowed. "Madam, I never intended. Intention is irrelevant," Margaret snapped. "What matters is consequence." She gestured sharply toward Agnes's stomach. "You stand there swollen with sin and you expect sympathy." Agnes shook her head. "I expect nothing," she whispered. "I only ask to keep my child safe." A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. Margaret leaned forward. "Then answer me," she said. "Who is the father?" Agnes closed her eyes briefly. Images flashed through her mind, the rain, the stranger's jacket, the warmth of a night that felt human. She opened her eyes again, tears spilling freely now. "I cannot tell you," she said. Margaret's hand came down hard on the arm of the chair. "You will," she said, her voice sharp with fury. "Or I will assume the worst." Agnes's voice broke. "He did not belong to this house. He did not force me. I beg you, do not punish the child." That plea was the moment everything shifted. Margaret rose to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Do you hear this?" she said, turning to the others. "She dares to lecture me about punishment." Her gaze snapped back to Agnes. "Girls like you destroy families," she continued. "You tempt men, you bring disorder, and then you hide behind innocence." Agnes shook her head violently. "That is not true." "Silence!" Margaret shouted. The word cracked through the room like a whip. Agnes flinched instinctively, wrapping her arms around her belly. Margaret's eyes followed the movement, narrowing. "You think that will save you?" she asked coldly. "You think pregnancy is a shield?" Mama Wanjiku could not remain still any longer. She stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly together. "Madam," she said, her voice trembling, but clear, "please, whatever anger you feel, this is not the way. She could lose the baby. She could—" Margaret turned on her with blazing eyes. "You," she said quietly, "will step back." Mama Wanjiku hesitated for a fraction of a second. Margaret raised her hand. "Now." Mama Wanjiku obeyed, tears streaking down her face as she returned to the line. The other servants stared at the floor, shame and fear etched into their expressions. Margaret faced Agnes again. "This house runs on discipline," she said. "Without it, everything rots." She gestured toward the courtyard beyond the open doors. "You will be punished where everyone can see," she continued, "so no one forgets what happens when rules are broken." Agnes felt the blood drain from her face. "Madam, please," she sobbed. "I will leave. I will go anywhere. Just let me walk away." Margaret's laugh was short and cruel. "You don't get to choose your exit," she said. "You made this disgrace public. The correction will be public as well." Two men stepped forward hesitantly. Agnes backed away instinctively, her heel catching on the edge of the rug. She nearly fell, catching herself just in time. "Don't touch her!" Mama Wanjiku cried out before she could stop herself. Margaret's gaze snapped to her. "Remove her," she said icily. "And if anyone else speaks, they will join her." The men approached. Faces, pale movements, stiff with reluctance. One reached for Agnes's arm. "Please," Agnes cried, her voice breaking completely. "My baby." She was cut off as she was dragged toward the courtyard. The morning sun was harsh, glaring down on the stone ground as Agnes was shoved forward. She stumbled, barely keeping her balance. The servants followed at a distance, helpless witnesses to a spectacle none of them wanted to see. Margaret stepped out last. Composed and unhurried, Agnes dropped to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably, now clutching her stomach with both hands. "Please," she begged again, her voice hoarse. "I will do anything." Margaret looked down at her with detached disgust. "You should have thought of that before," she said. The first blow came without warning. Agnes cried out as pain exploded through her side. She collapsed forward, her palms scraping against the stone. The shock stole her breath. She tried to curl around her belly, desperate to protect the life inside her. "Stop," someone whispered behind them. Margaret raised her hand again. "Continue," she ordered. The second blow knocked Agnes sideways. She gasped a sharp, strangled sound as a hot pain spread through her abdomen. Fear surged through her like fire. The baby moved, or maybe it was her imagination. Either way, panic consumed her. "Please," she sobbed. "You're hurting my child." Margaret's face hardened further, if that was possible. "That child is your shame," she said, "and shame must be beaten out." A third blow landed. Agnes screamed, the sound raw and desperate. Blood seeped through the fabric of her dress, darkening against the pale stone beneath her. Her vision blurred the world, tilting dangerously. Mama Wanjiku cried out again, her body shaking as she watched. Somewhere behind her, a younger maid covered her mouth to stifle a sob. No one moved. No one dared. As Agnes's strength gave out, she collapsed fully onto the ground, her cheek pressed against the cold stone. Her breathing came in shallow, panicked bursts, tears mixed with blood and dust. Margaret stood over her chest, rising and falling, her expression unyielding. "Let this be the last time," she said to the gathered servants, "that anyone forgets their place." Agnes heard the words dimly, as though they came from far away. Her hands trembled weakly against her stomach. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the child, to herself, to a world that had never made space for mercy. The courtyard seemed to spin, and then everything went dark. Agnes did not remember falling. One moment the world was a blur of stone and sky and pain. The next there was nothing. No sound, no light, no breath. When sensation returned, it came in fragments, sharp and disjointed. A ringing filled her ears. Her mouth tasted of metal. Her body felt impossibly heavy, as if gravity itself had decided to claim her. She lay on the courtyard stones, unmoving. The servants stood frozen at the edges, trapped between terror and conscience. Someone whispered her name. Someone else turned away, unable to watch any longer. Margaret Whitmore remained where she was, rigid and composed, her gaze fixed forward as though the scene had already ended in her mind. "Get her up," Margaret said at last. "She's pretending." No one moved. Agnes's chest rose shallowly, then stilled again. A dark stain spread beneath her dress, thin at first, then unmistakable. Mama Wanjiku saw it and gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. Her knees buckled, but she caught herself on the edge of a pillar. "She's bleeding," Mama Wanjiku whispered. "Madam, she's bleeding." Margaret's eyes flicked downward. For a fraction of a second, so brief it could have been imagined, uncertainty crossed her face. Then it hardened again. "Clean this mess," she snapped, "and get her out of my sight." A gardener named Peter took a step forward, on his face pale. "Madam," he said carefully, "she's not moving." Silence followed, thick, heavy, dangerous. Margaret turned toward him slowly. "Are you questioning me?" she asked. Peter shook his head quickly. "No, madam. I'm only saying she may need enough, Margaret said. Do as you're told. Peter hesitated. Then with a glance at Mama Wanjiku, he slipped his hand into his pocket. Hidden behind the hedge and the watching eyes, he pulled out his phone and dialed with trembling fingers. Emergency, he whispered when the line connected. A pregnant woman. She's been beaten. Please, he ended the call and tucked the phone away, his heart pounding as though it might burst from his chest. Agnes drifted somewhere between waking and darkness. She felt hands lifting her voices, murmuring urgently. Pain flared when her body was moved, a white-hot agony that ripped a cry from her throat, before fading again. She heard Mama Wanjiku's voice, close to her ear, breaking and desperate. Hold on, child, Mama Wanjiku whispered. Please hold on. Sirens pierced the morning air moments later, distant at first, then rapidly growing louder. The sound cut through the stillness like a blade. Servants exchanged looks of alarm. Margaret's jaw tightened. An ambulance screeched to a stop outside the gate. 2 paramedics rushed into the courtyard, their movements swift and practiced. They knelt beside Agnes, assessing her condition with urgent efficiency. Severe trauma, one said quietly. Possible placental abruption. They lifted Agnes onto a stretcher, working quickly to stabilize her. As they wheeled her toward the gate, Mama Wanjiku reached out, clutching the side of the stretcher. I'm coming with her, she said. Margaret stepped forward. You will not, she said coldly. She is no longer my responsibility. Mama Wanjiku turned to face her, then tears streaming openly down her face. She was your responsibility when you beat her, she said, her voice shaking with grief and fury. The paramedic glanced between them, then shook his head. We're leaving, he said. Now. The gate swung open, the ambulance doors slammed shut, and just like that, Agnes Rotich was gone. The mansion fell into a stunned, unnatural silence. Margaret stood alone in the courtyard, staring at the empty space where Agnes had lain. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she turned sharply and walked back inside. Return to work, she ordered. This is over. But it wasn't over. At the public hospital, chaos ruled. Agnes was rushed through corridors lined with peeling paint and flickering lights. Nurses shouted instructions. A doctor, Dr. Elijah Otieno, met the stretcher at the entrance to the emergency ward, his face grave as he took in the sight before him. She's lost a lot of blood, he said. Get her to trauma now. Agnes's consciousness surfaced briefly as she was transferred to a narrow hospital bed. The ceiling lights blurred above her. She tried to speak, but her throat refused to cooperate. Stay with us, a nurse urged. You're safe now. Safe! The word sounded foreign. Pain tore through Agnes's abdomen stronger than before, a deep, wrenching sensation that made her gasp. Fear surged, eclipsing everything else. My baby. She whispered the words barely audible. Please, my baby. Dr. Otieno leaned close. We're doing everything we can, he said gently. But you need to stay calm. Calm felt impossible. Agnes drifted in and out of awareness as doctors worked around her. At one point she heard someone say, fetal distress. At another she felt a needle slide into her arm. Her body shook uncontrollably, tears streaming down her temples. Mama Wanjiku arrived at the hospital breathless, her headscarf askew, eyes wild with fear. She had followed the ambulance on a motorbike, refusing to be left behind. She's alone, she told the nurse at the desk. I'm her family. The nurse nodded sympathy, softening her tired expression. You can sit with her, she said. Mama Wanjiku took Agnes's hand, warm and trembling. I'm here, she whispered. You're not alone. Agnes squeezed her fingers weakly. Hours passed in agonizing uncertainty. Dr. Otieno emerged from the examination room at last, his expression heavy. Mama Wanjiku stood quickly, hope and dread battling in her eyes. She's stable for now, he said, but the trauma was severe. The pregnancy is at serious risk. Mama Wanjiku's shoulders sagged. The baby, she asked. We don't know yet, Dr. Otieno replied honestly. The next few hours will be critical. Agnes overheard the words through a haze of pain and medication. A sob tore from her chest, raw and broken. Mama Wanjiku bent close, pressing her forehead to Agnes's. Listen to me, she whispered fiercely. You have survived worse than this. So has your child. Agnes nodded weakly, tears soaking into the pillow beneath her head. Somewhere across the city, life continued as though nothing had happened. Cars moved through traffic. Meetings began and ended. Margaret Whitmore sat in her office making calls, smoothing reputations, erasing inconvenience. But in a narrow hospital bed, a young woman fought for her life and the life of her unborn child. Alone, bruised and bleeding, and unseen forces were already shifting, because the violence that had been hidden behind gates and wealth was about to spill into the open, because silence once broken could not be restored. And because the truth, long buried beneath power and fear, was beginning to rise. Agnes woke to the sound of beeping, slow, steady, unfamiliar. For a moment she did not know where she was. The ceiling above her was pale and cracked, a faint stain, spreading like a cloud near one corner. The air smelled of disinfectant and something metallic. Her body felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else. When she tried to move, pain surged through her abdomen, sharp and unforgiving, forcing a soft cry from her lips. A hand tightened around hers. Easy, a gentle voice said. You're awake. Agnes turned her head slowly. Mama Wanjiku sat beside the bed, her eyes red and swollen, her back bent with exhaustion. Relief flooded her face the moment their eyes met. Thank God, Mama Wanjiku whispered. You scared us. Agnes tried to speak, but her throat was dry. Her lips trembled as she forced out the only question that mattered. My baby. Mama Wanjiku's expression faltered just for a second. She glanced toward the door, then back at Agnes, squeezing her hand. The doctor is watching closely, she said carefully. You're both still here. That is what matters right now. Still here. Agnes closed her eyes, tears slipping silently down her temples. She placed a trembling hand over her stomach, half expecting emptiness. Beneath her palm she felt warmth, and then faintly a small movement. A sob broke free. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. Mama Wanjiku leaned forward, pressing her forehead to Agnes's. Hush, she murmured. This is not your fault. None of it. The door creaked open and Dr. Elijah Otieno stepped inside, his expression composed but heavy. He glanced at the monitor, then at Agnes. You've been through severe physical trauma, he said calmly. We've stabilized the bleeding for now, but you need to understand something. Agnes's heart pounded. The pregnancy is still at risk, he continued. Your body and the baby are under a lot of stress. Any further shock, physical or emotional, could be dangerous. Mama Wanjiku straightened. She won't be going back there, she said firmly. Dr. Otieno nodded. Good. Agnes opened her eyes again, fear creeping in around the edges. Where will I go? She asked quietly. The question hung unanswered. She had no home, no savings, no family. The mansion gates were closed to her forever, even if she wanted to return, which she didn't. The thought alone made her chest tighten. Dr. Otieno hesitated, then spoke gently. For now you will stay here. We won't discharge you until it's safe. After that, we will see. After that felt terrifyingly vague. The hours that followed the blurred together. Nurses came and went. Medications were adjusted. Agnes slept in fragments, waking often to pain or fear. Each time Mama Wanjiku was there, a steady presence anchoring her to the moment. Outside the hospital room, whispers began to travel. A nurse mentioned a pregnant woman beaten by her employer. Another spoke of a wealthy family trying to silence witnesses. Phones buzzed quietly in pockets. Someone snapped a photo of the ambulance arrival. Someone else recognized the address from earlier rumors. By evening, the story had found its way online. At first it was vague, a post shared by a hospital orderly, a comment by a neighbor. But Nairobi was a city where stories moved fast, especially when wealth and cruelty collided. By nightfall, the headline had sharpened. Pregnant housemaid hospitalized after alleged assault by employer. Agnes knew nothing of this. She lay in her bed, staring at the wall, listening to the distant hum of the ward. Her thoughts circled endlessly around the same questions. Had the baby been hurt? Would she be able to work again? What kind of future awaited a woman like her now? At some point, Nurse Naledi Kumalo entered quietly, checking Agnes's IV and adjusting her pillow. Her movements were efficient, but her eyes held something warmer. "You're very strong," she said softly. Agnes managed a faint smile. "I don't feel strong," Naledi shook her head. "Most strength doesn't feel like strength while you're carrying it." She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "There's something you should know. People are asking questions about what happened to you." Agnes's breath caught. "I don't want trouble." Naledi met her gaze. "Sometimes trouble comes whether we invite it or not." Later that night, Agnes overheard raised voices near the nurse's station. She caught fragments lawyers press donations. Her name floated through the air like something unreal. Mama Wanjiku returned from stepping outside, her face pale. "They are talking about the house," she said quietly. "About Madame Margaret." Agnes turned away, her stomach twisting. "I don't want revenge," she whispered. "I just want peace." Mama Wanjiku stroked her hair gently. "Peace is not always silence," she said. Across the city, Margaret Whitmore sat in her study, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. "No names," she said sharply. "And make sure the hospital understands their obligations." She ended the call and exhaled slowly, her composure intact. The situation was inconvenient but manageable. Scandals faded. Money softened edges. She had handled worse. Still, when she closed her eyes, she saw the blood on the courtyard stones. She dismissed the image angrily. Agnes, meanwhile, drifted into uneasy sleep. Dreams tangled with memories, the rain-soaked night, the stranger's quiet voice, the warmth of a jacket around her shoulders. She woke suddenly, heart racing, convinced for a moment that someone stood at her bedside. No one was there. Just the steady beep of the monitor. Just Mama Wanjiku's soft breathing from the chair beside her. Just the faint movement beneath her hand, reminding her that she was not alone. By morning, the ward was buzzing. A doctor whispered to another about an incoming visitor, someone important. A nurse adjusted her uniform nervously. Naledi returned, her expression serious. "There's a man asking to see you," she said. Agnes frowned weakly. "Who?" Naledi hesitated. "He says his name is Simon Mbeki." The name hit Agnes like a sudden gust of cold air. She did not know why. She had never heard it before. Or had she? Something deep inside her stirred an echo without a shape. Her heart began to pound, a strange mix of fear and anticipation rising in her chest. "I don't know anyone by that name," she said softly. Naledi nodded. "He said he understands." "He asked only for a moment." Mama Wanjiku stiffened. "Is he from the house?" Naledi shook her head. "No. But he doesn't look like a man who is used to being refused." Agnes closed her eyes briefly, gathering herself. The doctor's warning echoed in her mind, no further shock. But life did not pause for recovery. "Tell him," Agnes said at last, "that he can come in." As Naledi turned to leave, Agnes's hand tightened instinctively over her belly. She had no idea who Simon Mbeki was or why his presence felt like the beginning of something irreversible. But deep within her, a truth she had not yet named was stirring. and the fragile silence of the hospital room was about to break. Simon Mbeki stood just outside the hospital ward, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. He had imagined this moment differently, more controlled, more distant. He had come to Nairobi believing he would assess a situation, make decisions, and leave again if necessary. That was how he handled most problems methodically, efficiently, without letting emotion cloud judgment. But standing there now listening to the muted sounds of the hospital, the shuffling feet, the quiet moans, the hurried whispers, he felt something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. This was no longer an abstract scandal. This was a human life. Simon had followed the story as it unfolded online. At first he told himself it was exaggerated, another headline, designed to provoke outrage. Yet every new detail had chipped away at that illusion. Witnesses, photos, medical reports leaked anonymously. And always the same description of the house, the same gated estate, the same unmistakable figure at the center of it all. His mother. The realization had landed like a blow. Simon did not defend her actions to himself. Not fully. He had seen her capacity for cruelty before, though never to this degree. Still, part of him resisted believing the worst. Margaret Whitmore was harsh. Yes, but this beating a pregnant woman. The answer lay behind the door in front of him. When Nurse Naledi returned, her expression unreadable. Simon straightened instinctively. "She agreed to see you," she said. Simon nodded, his throat suddenly tight. "Thank you." Naledi hesitated, then added quietly, "Please be gentle. She's been through more than enough." The door opened. Simon stepped inside and froze. The woman lying in the narrow hospital bed looked small, far smaller than he had imagined. Her face was pale, bruised along one cheek, her lips dry and cracked. Tubes and wires surrounded her, and her hands rested protectively over her belly, as though shielding something precious from the world. For a heartbeat, Simon could not move. Something about her posture, the way she held herself even in pain, felt hauntingly familiar. Agnes watched him cautiously, her dark eyes alert despite exhaustion. Mama Wanjiku sat beside the bed, her gaze sharp and distrustful, ready to intervene if necessary. Simon swallowed. "My name is Simon Mbeki," he said gently. I'm here because of what happened to you." Agnes said nothing. He took a step closer, stopping well short of the bed. "I'm not here to defend anyone," he continued, "and I'm not here to intimidate you. I just want to understand." Agnes's fingers tightened slightly against her stomach. "Understand what?" she asked quietly. Simon hesitated. He had rehearsed explanations on the drive to the hospital, but none of them seemed adequate now. "I grew up in that house," he said finally. "The one where you worked." Mama Wanjiku stiffened. Agnes's eyes flickered with recognition. Not of him, but of the place he represented. Her jaw tightened. "Then you already know what kind of woman she is," Agnes said softly. Simon nodded. "I do." Silence stretched between them, heavy but not hostile. Simon's gaze drifted briefly to Agnes's stomach, then back to her face. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for what you went through." The words were simple, but Agnes felt their weight. No one from that world had ever apologized to her before. She looked away. "Sorry doesn't undo bruises," she said. "No," Simon agreed. "It doesn't." Mama Wanjiku studied him closely. "Why are you really here?" she asked. Simon met her gaze. "Because I believe the truth matters," he said. "And because I saw a picture of her, of Agnes, on the news. And something about it wouldn't let me sleep." Agnes turned back to him sharply. "What picture?" Simon described it briefly. A grainy image taken from behind a gate. Agnes barely visible as she was dragged across the courtyard. He did not mention blood. He did not need to. Agnes's breathing quickened slightly. "That was you?" she asked. Simon nodded. "That was the moment I booked a flight." He paused, then added, I don't want this buried, and I don't want you silenced. Agnes laughed softly, a sound edged with bitterness. People like me are always silenced, she said. It's how the world stays comfortable. Simon felt the truth of her words settle uncomfortably in his chest. I can help, he said. Agnes shook her head. I don't want money. I wasn't offering money, Simon replied. I was offering protection. Mama Wanjiku leaned forward. Protection from whom? Simon answered without hesitation. From my mother. The name hung in the air unspoken but heavy. Agnes studied him carefully now, searching for something sincerity, perhaps. She saw no arrogance in his eyes, only conflict. You cannot protect me from her, Agnes said quietly. She has power, she has lawyers, I have nothing. Simon took a slow breath. You have the truth, he said, and you have witnesses. Agnes's gaze dropped to her belly. And I have a child to think about. Simon followed her gaze, his chest tightening inexplicably. For reasons he could not yet articulate, the sight stirred something deep and uneasy within him. Has the baby been hurt? He asked softly. Agnes hesitated. The doctors say we don't know yet. Simon nodded, absorbing the weight of that uncertainty. He felt a surge of anger, hot, sharp, unfamiliar toward his mother, toward the system that had allowed this to happen, toward himself for having stayed away so long. I want to do something, he said quietly. Something that actually helps. Agnes looked at him again, her eyes tired but sharp. Why, she asked. Why do you care? Simon opened his mouth to answer and stopped, because he didn't know. Or rather, he knew too many things at once, because he had seen cruelty dressed as discipline his entire life, because he had walked away once and told himself it was enough, because something about Agnes's face, her voice, her quiet strength felt uncomfortably close to something he had lost. I care, he said finally, because silence is what allows people like her to keep hurting others. Agnes considered his words carefully. Mama Wanjiku watched the exchange, suspicion slowly giving way to something like cautious hope. Then listen to her, Mama Wanjiku said firmly. That is how you help. Simon nodded. I'm listening. Agnes took a deep breath, wincing slightly as pain flared. She spoke slowly, choosing her words with care. I don't want revenge, she said. I don't want headlines or sympathy. I want my child to live. I want to work again someday without fear. And I want to know that what happened to me won't happen to another girl after me. Simon felt something shift inside him. That's not too much to ask, he said. Agnes gave a small, sad smile. It is for people like us. Before Simon could respond, Dr. Otieno entered the room, his expression professional but alert. We need to limit visitors, he said gently. She needs rest. Simon nodded immediately. Of course. He turned back to Agnes. I'll come back, he said, if you'll allow me. Agnes hesitated, then nodded once. As Simon left the room, his mind raced. The encounter had unsettled him more than he expected. Something about Agnes's presence lingered with him, a sense of unfinished recognition, tugging at the edges of his memory. He walked down the hospital corridor slowly, his thoughts colliding. This was no longer about reputation management. This was about accountability, and somewhere between the truth Agnes carried and the blood she shed, Simon felt certain that his life and his family were standing at the edge of a revelation he could not yet see clearly. But it was coming, and when it did, nothing would remain the same. Simon did not sleep that night. He sat in a quiet hotel room overlooking Nairobi's restless glow, the city humming below like a living thing that refused to slow down. The meeting with Agnes replayed itself again and again in his mind, not as a single moment, but as a series of small, unsettling details that refused to align neatly. The way she held her stomach even when she was barely conscious of it. the steadiness in her voice despite everything she had endured, and the strange familiarity he could not name. Simon told himself it was sympathy, guilt, anger. Any of those explanations would have been easier. But as he stared at the ceiling, he knew the truth was more complicated. He remembered the rain. The memory surfaced suddenly uninvited. A night, months ago, when he had walked without direction, letting the city swallow him. He had needed distance from boardrooms, from expectations, from the constant echo of his mother's voice, telling him who he should be. That night the rain had come down hard, the kind that soaked through thought and reason alike. And there had been a woman, quiet, shaken, clutching torn bags on a dark street. Simon sat up abruptly. He remembered her eyes now. Not clearly, not her face in full detail, but the way she had looked at him, as if she were surprised he was kind. He remembered offering his jacket the shelter of unfinished walls, the way their conversation had unfolded without pretense. He had never asked her name. She had never asked his. At the time, it had felt like mercy, a fleeting connection with no consequences. Two strangers parting cleanly, untouched by expectation. Simon's chest tightened. No, he told himself. It can't be. But doubt, once planted, grew quickly. The timing matched. The place matched. And Agnes's silence about the father, her insistence that he did not belong to the house, suddenly carried new weight. Simon buried his face in his hands. If the possibility forming in his mind was real, then everything shifted. Not just legally or socially, but morally. The violence his mother had inflicted would no longer be an abstract injustice. It would be personal, intimate, unforgivable. By morning, Simon had made a decision. He returned to the hospital early, before reporters gathered outside, before lawyers arrived with rehearsed apologies. He asked to speak with Dr. Elijah Otieno, privately. The doctor studied him carefully. "I understand who you are," Dr. Otieno said, "and I understand why you're here." Simon nodded. "I need the truth," he said. "Not for the press, not for my family's reputation. For her." Dr. Otieno folded his arms. "What truth?" Simon hesitated only a moment. "I believe the child she's carrying may be mine." The words sounded unreal, even as he spoke them. Dr. Otieno did not react immediately. He looked at Simon for a long moment, searching his face. Then he sighed quietly. "Then you understand the gravity of what you're asking," he said. "I do." Dr. Otieno nodded slowly. "This cannot be done without her consent, and given her condition, it must be handled with extreme care. I won't pressure her," Simon said quickly. "I won't frighten her. If she says no, I will respect that." Dr. Otieno regarded him steadily. "Very well," he said. "But understand this, once the truth is known, it cannot be returned to silence." "I know," Simon replied. Later that morning, Agnes woke to sunlight filtering through thin hospital curtains. Her body ached in places she hadn't known could ache, but the pain was duller now, more distant. Mama Wanjiku slept lightly in the chair beside her, exhaustion finally claiming her. When Agnes saw Simon enter quietly, she tensed. "I'm sorry to disturb you," Simon said softly. "I just wanted to check on you." Agnes nodded. "The pain is less today," she said. "The doctor says that's a good sign." "I'm glad," Simon replied. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, but weighted. "There's something I need to ask you," Simon said carefully. "And if you don't want to answer, you don't have to." Agnes studied him warily. "What is it?" Simon chose his words slowly. "The night you spoke of, the one where you met the child's father. You said he helped you during the rain." Agnes's eyes flickered with surprise. "Yes." "Do you remember anything else about him?" Simon asked. "Anything at all?" Agnes hesitated. Her hand drifted unconsciously to her belly. "He was kind," she said quietly. "Tired. He spoke like someone who carried many expectations." Simon swallowed. Did he tell you his name? He asked. Number. Did you tell him yours number? Agnes frowned slightly. Why are you asking me this? Simon met her gaze. Because I believe that man may have been me. The words fell into the room like fragile glass. Agnes stared at him, her mind rejecting the idea before it could form fully. She searched his face, her breathing shallow. That's impossible, she whispered. I know how it sounds, Simon said, but the timing, the place, everything matches. Agnes shook her head slowly. You're wealthy, she said. You live in a world far from mine. Simon nodded. I know. That's why I didn't tell you who I was. A long silence followed. Agnes closed her eyes, memories stirring painfully the jacket, the voice, the gentleness that had felt so rare. When she opened her eyes again, they were filled with confusion and fear. If what you're saying is true, she said quietly, then your mother. Simon nodded, pain etched into his expression. She beat you without knowing she was harming her own grandchild. Agnes's breath caught. She turned her face away, tears spilling freely now, not of anger but of overwhelming shock. Mama Wanjiku stirred, sensing the shift in the room. Simon stepped back slightly, giving Agnes space. I'm not asking you to forgive anything, he said. I'm asking you to help me confirm the truth. If I'm wrong, I'll walk away and never trouble you again. If I'm right, he trailed off. Agnes pressed a trembling hand to her stomach, feeling a faint kick beneath her palm. Her world felt suddenly unstable, the ground beneath her shifting in ways she could not yet comprehend. If this is true, she said slowly, then my child was never safe, not even before they were born. Simon nodded, unable to deny it. Agnes inhaled deeply, then exhaled with shaking resolve. I don't want secrets anymore, she said. They've only brought pain. She looked at Simon directly. If there is a test that can tell the truth, then we should do it. Mama Wanjiku gasped softly. Child Agnes squeezed her hand. I need to know, she said, for the baby. Simon felt his chest tighten with a mixture of relief and dread. I'll arrange everything, he said, quietly, safely, as doctor. Otieno was called back in to explain the process. Agnes lay back against her pillow, exhaustion washing over her. The decision she had just made felt enormous, larger than fear, larger than shame. The truth, once buried beneath rain and silence, was rising, and when it reached the surface, it would force every person connected to it, Agnes, Simon, and Margaret Whitmore herself, to confront the cost of cruelty and the weight of blood. The test was arranged quietly. No announcements. No paperwork passed through Margaret Whitmore's offices. Dr. Elijah Otieno handled everything personally, selecting a small team he trusted and scheduling the procedure during a low-traffic hour in the hospital. For Agnes, the discretion was both a relief and a burden. Silence, she had learned, could protect, but it could also suffocate. As the nurse prepared the room, Agnes stared at the pale blue wall opposite her bed, counting her breaths. Mama Wanjiku stood nearby, her hands folded tightly at her waist lips, moving in a prayer too soft to hear. Simon remained at a respectful distance. He did not touch Agnes. He did not rush her. He spoke only when spoken to. The restraint was deliberate, born from a growing understanding that power, real power, was not about presence, but about restraint. Dr. Otieno explained the procedure in calm, precise language. A prenatal DNA test using Agnes's blood sample and Simon's. Minimal risk. Careful monitoring. Immediate rest afterward. Agnes nodded, her fingers clenched lightly into the sheet. Are you ready? Dr. Otieno asked. Agnes closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. Yes. The needle prick was quick, a brief sting followed by pressure. Agnes barely reacted. Pain had lost its sharpness after everything else she had endured. It had become a dull companion, always present, no longer surprising. When it was over, She lay back exhausted. "The results will take a few days," Dr. Otieno said. "I know waiting is difficult, but this is the safest way." A few days. Agnes had lived years in uncertainty. A few more days felt unbearable. After the test, Simon left the hospital. He did not trust himself to stay. Every corridor, every echo of footsteps, amplified the weight of what might be true. If the child was his, then the distance he had maintained from his family was no longer just emotional, it was moral. He returned to his hotel and spent hours on the phone, not with lawyers, but with people he trusted, journalists who valued integrity, advocates who protected vulnerable workers, legal experts who specialized in domestic abuse cases. He did not reveal names. Not yet. But he prepared. Agnes, meanwhile, was forced to confront a different kind of waiting. Each night she lay awake listening to the sounds of the ward, the beeping monitors, the muffled cries, the quiet footsteps of nurses moving from bed to bed. Her hand rested on her stomach, feeling for movement, reassurance, life. She thought of the night in the rain. She replayed it now with painful clarity, the man's voice, the way he listened without interrupting, the gentleness that had felt like a rare gift. In her memory, his face sharpened, aligning with Simon's features in ways that made her chest ache. How could something born of kindness lead to such violence? Mama Wanjiku tried to distract her with stories, memories of her own youth, of children she had helped raise in other people's homes, of small joys that had once seemed impossible, and then quietly arrived. "You see," Mama Wanjiku said one afternoon, adjusting Agnes's pillow, "life bends, but it does not always break." Agnes smiled faintly. "It feels broken." Mama Wanjiku nodded. "Sometimes healing hurts more than the wound." Outside the hospital, the story continued to grow. Despite Margaret Whitmore's efforts to suppress it, too many people had seen too much. A gardener had spoken anonymously. A neighbor had shared a video clip taken from across the street. Donations poured into a small fund, started by hospital staff to support Agnes's care. Margaret watched it all unfold from behind closed doors. Her calls were returned more slowly now. Invitations were rescinded quietly. A board meeting was postponed. Nothing dramatic, just enough to unsettle the ground beneath her feet. She told herself it would pass. She had built her life on control. She had survived worse. Still, when she stood alone in her study at night, she found herself staring at her hands, hands that had ordered violence, hands that had raised a legacy of fear. The image of Agnes collapsing on the courtyard stones intruded more often now, unwelcome and persistent. Margaret dismissed it with anger. Weakness was contagious, she told herself. Regret was indulgent. Back at the hospital, the days crawled. Agnes's condition stabilized, but the doctors remained cautious. Stress, they warned, was dangerous, yet stress was unavoidable. Every time her phone buzzed with an unknown number, her heart jumped. Every time footsteps paused outside her room, her breath caught. Simon visited briefly, bringing no flowers, no gifts, only quiet presence. "How are you feeling today?" he asked one evening. "Tired," Agnes admitted. "And scared." Simon nodded. "That makes sense." She studied him carefully. "Are you afraid too?" He did not answer immediately. "Yes," he said finally, "but not of the truth." Agnes considered that. "What then? Of what the truth will ask of me." Simon replied. She understood that more than he knew. On the third day, Dr. Otieno called Simon early in the morning. "The results are in," he said. "You should come." Simon arrived at the hospital within minutes, his composure tight but controlled. Agnes was already awake, sitting upright in bed, Mama Wanjiku beside her. She knew before anyone spoke. Her body recognized the gravity in the room. Dr. Otieno closed the door behind him. "I want to be clear," he said gently. "Whatever these results say, nothing changes the care we provide, and nothing diminishes what you've endured." Agnes nodded her hands, trembling slightly. Simon stood still, his jaw clenched. Dr. Otieno opened the folder. The test confirms, he said slowly, that Simon Mbeki is the biological father of the child. The room fell silent. Agnes felt as though the air had been pulled from her lungs. She stared at the wall, her mind refusing to accept the words, then suddenly accepting all of them at once. A rush of heat surged through her chest, shock, grief, vindication, fear, colliding without order. Mama Wanjiku covered her mouth, tears spilling freely. "Oh, child," she whispered. Simon closed his eyes. When he opened them again, something had shifted, irrevocably. The uncertainty that had haunted him was gone, replaced by a clarity that burned. "I'm so sorry," he said quietly, his voice breaking despite his effort to keep it steady. "I should have found you sooner. I should have protected you." Agnes turned to him slowly. "This is not about what you should have done," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "It's about what happens now." Simon nodded. "I will take responsibility," he said, "fully, publicly, and I will ensure my mother answers for what she did." Mama Wanjiku looked between them, fear and hope tangled together. "This will destroy her," she said softly. Simon did not look away. "It should," he replied. "Power without accountability destroys others. It's time it faced itself." Agnes pressed a hand to her belly, feeling a strong kick beneath her palm, stronger than before. "For my child," she said quietly. "I want truth, not revenge, and not silence." Simon met her gaze. "Then that is what we will have." Outside the room, the hospital carried on patients arriving, nurses working, lives unfolding as they always did. But inside, a line had been crossed. The truth, once whispered in rain and hidden in fear, had spoken clearly at last. And it was no longer possible to pretend nothing had happened. The waiting was over. What remained was reckoning. Margaret Whitmore arrived at the hospital, in a black sedan, with tinted windows, her posture as immaculate as ever. She did not come alone. A lawyer waited in the car. A driver stood near the entrance, eyes scanning the surroundings. Margaret herself walked through the hospital doors with measured steps, chin lifted as though the building existed to serve her rather than the other way around. Whispers followed her down the corridor. She ignored them. Hospitals were inconvenient places. Too many witnesses. Too much vulnerability. Margaret disliked them for the same reason she disliked anything she could not control. Still, the call she had received that morning had been precise and unyielding. "Please come to the hospital. It concerns the woman you dismissed." Dismissed. That was the word she preferred. As Margaret approached the ward, Nurse Naledi Kumalo intercepted her politely, but firmly. "This way, madam," she said, gesturing toward a private room. Margaret nodded curtly and followed. The room was quiet when she entered. Agnes lay on the bed, pale but upright, her hands folded protectively over her stomach. Mama Wanjiku sat beside her, shoulders tense. Simon stood near the window, his back straight, his expression unreadable. Margaret's gaze swept the room, dismissive and sharp. "So," she said coolly, "this is the performance." Agnes stiffened, but she did not speak. Simon turned slowly to face his mother. "This is not a performance," he said. "It's a reckoning." Margaret's eyes flicked to him, surprise flashing briefly before hardening into irritation. "Simon," she said, "I didn't expect you to involve yourself in this nonsense." "Nonsense," Simon echoed quietly. Margaret waved a hand dismissively toward Agnes. "A foolish girl who broke the rules and now wants compensation. I've seen it before." Agnes's fingers tightened against the blanket. Mama Wanjiku leaned forward, anger trembling through her restraint. "She nearly died," Mama Wanjiku said. "Your orders did that." Margaret's gaze snapped toward her. "You will not speak unless spoken to." Simon stepped forward. "She will speak," he said calmly, "and so will Agnes if she chooses." Margaret's eyes narrowed. You are forgetting your place. No, Simon replied. I'm finally standing in it. Silence fell. Margaret turned her attention back to Agnes, her lips curling slightly. I suppose you've told your story, she said. Exaggerated, I'm sure. Bruises fade. Drama doesn't. Agnes lifted her head slowly. I didn't come here for drama, she said quietly. I came here because I almost lost my child. Margaret scoffed. Your child, she repeated, as if that excuses everything. Dr. Elijah Otieno entered, then closing the door behind him. He carried a thin folder in his hand, his expression composed but firm. Mrs. Whitmore, he said. Thank you for coming. Margaret inclined her head slightly. Doctor, I assume this will be brief. Dr. Otieno did not respond to the provocation. We called you because there are medical and legal matters that require your attention, he said. This discussion concerns the assault that occurred on your property. Margaret's jaw tightened. Alleged assault. Dr. Otieno held her gaze steadily. The injuries were consistent with severe physical abuse. The patient was pregnant. Her life and the life of her unborn child were at significant risk. Margaret crossed her arms. Discipline can look unpleasant to those who don't understand order. Simon's voice cut through the room. Stop! Margaret turned on him sharply. You don't get to. I do. Simon set his tone unwavering, because this doesn't end the way you think it does. Margaret laughed softly. What are you threatening me with, Simon? Public opinion. You know how quickly it forgets. Simon took a slow breath. This isn't about public opinion, he said. It's about truth. Agnes felt her heart begin to race. Dr. Otieno stepped forward slightly. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, we conducted a medical procedure with the patient's full consent. Margaret glanced at him impatiently. And it was a prenatal DNA test, Dr. Otieno continued. The words landed heavily. Margaret's expression flickered. Not fear, but irritation. Why would that concern me? Simon met her gaze directly. Because the child Agnes is carrying is mine. For a moment, the room seemed to lose its sound. Margaret stared at her son, the meaning of his words refusing to settle. Don't be ridiculous, she said sharply. You're being manipulated. I'm not, Simon replied. The results are conclusive. Margaret turned to Dr. Otieno. This is absurd, she said. Tests can be falsified. They were not, Dr. Otieno said calmly. The results are clear. Margaret's gaze darted to Agnes for the first time, with something other than contempt. You, she said, her voice low and dangerous. You planned this. Agnes shook her head slowly. I didn't even know his name, she said. I didn't know who he was. Margaret laughed again, but the sound was strained. You expect me to believe that you accidentally found my son? I didn't find him, Agnes said quietly. He found me. Simon stepped closer to his mother. Enough, he said. You beat a pregnant woman. You ordered others to watch, and that woman was carrying your grandchild. Margaret staggered back a step, as if struck not physically, but by the weight of reality. Her composure cracked just slightly. No, she said. No, that's not possible. Dr. Otieno opened the folder and placed it gently on the table between them. The documentation is here, he said. You are welcome to review it. Margaret stared at the folder as though it were a threat. For the first time, doubt crept into her eyes. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper. As she scanned the results, her face drained of color. Her hand began to tremble. This must be wrong, she whispered. Simon did not soften his voice. It isn't. Margaret looked up at Agnes again. Really looked at her. At the bruises, at the guarded strength, at the hand, resting protectively over her stomach. Something inside her collapsed. Her breath hitched. "I didn't know," she said faintly. Agnes's voice was steady. "I know." Margaret's knees buckled. She grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself, her polished exterior finally shattering. "I hurt him," she whispered. "I hurt my own blood." The words tasted like ash. Mama Wanjiku watched silently, tears streaking down her face. Simon's eyes burned. "You hurt more than blood," he said. "You hurt a human being, and now you will face the consequences." Margaret looked up at her son, fear and regret warring across her features. "Simon, please," she said. "We can fix this quietly." Simon shook his head. "No more quiet," he said. "Quiet is what allowed this to happen." Agnes spoke, then her voice calm but resolute. "I don't want revenge," she said. "I want justice, and I want my child to grow up knowing the truth." Margaret stared at her tears streaming freely now. Slowly, unsteadily, she took a step forward, and then another. Her knees hit the floor with a dull sound. "I am sorry," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking as she looked up at Agnes. "I am so sorry." The room held its breath. Agnes looked at the woman kneeling before her, the woman who had ordered her beaten, who had nearly taken her child's life. She felt no triumph, only a deep, aching exhaustion. "This is not forgiveness," Agnes said quietly. "It is the beginning of accountability." Margaret bowed her head, sobbing. Outside the room, the hospital continued to hum with life. But inside, a powerful illusion had finally collapsed, and nothing would ever be the same again. Margaret Whitmore remained on her knees, long after the room fell silent. The polished floor pressed coldly against her skin, an unfamiliar sensation for a woman accustomed to standing above others, literally and figuratively. Her sobs were quiet, now broken into shallow breaths that seemed to struggle their way out of her chest. No one rushed to help her up. No one spoke. For the first time in decades, Margaret felt small. Agnes watched her without satisfaction. There was no sense of victory in seeing the woman who had destroyed her dignity reduced to tears. Instead, Agnes felt an unexpected heaviness settle inside her, an understanding that pain once unleashed rarely chose its targets carefully. It spilled outward, touching everyone it reached. Simon stood rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. Part of him had imagined this moment for years, not this exact scene, but something like it. A confrontation, an admission, a breaking point. Yet standing there now, he felt no relief. Only a sharp, aching clarity. "You don't get to apologize and walk away," Simon said at last. Margaret flinched as if struck. She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, her voice trembling. "I know," she whispered. "I know." Dr. Otieno cleared his throat gently. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "there are legal matters that must be addressed. The injuries sustained by Miss Rotich were severe. This case will not disappear." Margaret nodded weakly. "I won't make it disappear," she said. "I won't try." Simon turned toward her sharply. "Are you saying that because you're sorry," he asked, "or because you were caught?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Margaret closed her eyes. When she opened them again, there was no defiance, left only raw honesty. "Both," she said quietly. "I was blind, and I was cruel, and I convinced myself it was strength." Her gaze shifted to Agnes, and her voice broke again. "I taught myself that mercy was weakness," she said. "I forgot that it was humanity." Agnes drew a slow breath. Her body still ached. Her heart still carried fear, but she knew something important. This moment was not about Margaret's guilt. It was about Agnes's future. "I don't want your tears," Agnes said calmly. "I want safety. For myself, for my child, and for every woman who ever worked under your roof." Margaret nodded, tears dripping onto the floor. "You will have it," she said. Whatever you ask. Simon shook his head slightly. No, he said. Not whatever she asks, whatever justice demands. Margaret swallowed hard. Then I will face it. The weight of those words was immense. Within hours, the quiet of the hospital was replaced by controlled movement. Lawyers arrived, not Margaret's usual team, but independent counsel Simon had contacted. Statements were taken. Medical reports were formally filed. Witnesses were protected. For once, the machinery of power moved in a direction Margaret could not redirect. News of her collapse spread quickly. The story shifted almost overnight from rumor to reckoning. Headlines no longer whispered about allegations. They spoke of confirmed assault, of evidence, of a wealthy figure forced to confront her own brutality. Margaret Whitmore's name, once synonymous with influence, now carried a different weight. Agnes watched this from her hospital bed, distant and detached. The noise of the world felt far away. What mattered to her was smaller, quieter, closer, each flutter of movement beneath her hand, each breath she took without fear of being dragged away. Simon visited her often during those days, but he never stayed long. He knew rest was critical. More than that, he understood that presence did not mean ownership. "I'll arrange housing for you," he said one afternoon, standing near the door. "Somewhere safe, private. You won't have to worry." Agnes nodded. "Thank you." "And when the baby comes," Simon added carefully, "I want to be involved, but only in ways you're comfortable with." Agnes looked at him, then really looked at him. She saw regret there. Yes, responsibility, resolve. But she also saw restraint, respect. "That matters," she said quietly. Margaret, meanwhile, was suspended from several boards within days. Donations she had once given to charity were returned. Investigations were announced. Former employees began to speak their stories, echoing one another with chilling consistency. Each testimony stripped away another layer of Margaret's carefully constructed image. Alone in her empty mansion, Margaret sat in the same living room where Agnes had once stood, trembling before her. The chairs were perfectly arranged. The floors gleamed. Yet the silence was unbearable. For the first time, she did not fill it with commands. She remembered Simon as a boy, watching him shrink inward each time she corrected him, mistaking fear for discipline. She remembered the servants she had dismissed without a second thought. She remembered the words she had spoken to Agnes, sharp, final, unforgivable. And she understood something too late. Power without empathy was not strength. It was destruction wearing a respectable face. Back at the hospital, Dr. Otieno reviewed Agnes's latest scans with cautious optimism. "The baby is stable," he said. "You've both been through trauma, but you're holding on." Agnes closed her eyes, relief washing over her in a quiet wave. That night, as she lay alone in the dim light, Agnes placed both hands on her belly and spoke softly. "We survived," she whispered. "They tried to break us, but we survived." Tears slid silently into her hair. The next morning, Simon accompanied her to a small press conference held just outside the hospital, not to parade her pain, but to draw a clear line between truth and silence. Agnes did not speak. She did not need to. Simon did. "My mother's actions were inexcusable," he said, his voice steady, "and I will not shield her from accountability. Agnes Rotich deserves justice, not pity, and no amount of wealth excuses violence." Those words echoed far beyond the hospital gates. Margaret watched the broadcast alone, her hands folded in her lap. When Simon finished speaking, she bowed her head. Not in shame this time, but in acknowledgement. The reckoning had arrived, and as the world shifted around them, Agnes felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not safety, not certainty, but possibility. The kind that grows quietly, the way life itself does. Agnes Rotich left the hospital at dawn. The sky over Nairobi was pale, washed in soft blues and grays, as if the city itself were holding its breath. A car waited near the entrance, not a luxury vehicle but a modest one driven by a woman Simon trusted implicitly. There were no reporters, no cameras, only quiet movement and careful distance. Agnes moved slowly, one hand resting on her belly, the other gripping Mama Wanjiku's arm. "You don't have to come with me," Agnes said gently. Mama Wanjiku shook her head. "I go where you go," she replied, "until you no longer need me." Agnes smiled faintly. Simon stood a few steps away, giving her space. When she turned toward him, he nodded, respectful and restrained. "This place is temporary," he said, "just until you feel strong enough. No one will know where you are unless you want them to." Agnes met his gaze. "I don't want to hide forever," she said, "but right now I want peace." "You'll have it," Simon replied. The drive took them away from the noise of the city toward a quieter neighborhood on the outskirts of Nairobi. The house was small but warm, surrounded by trees and birdsong instead of walls and guards. Inside, sunlight spilled through open windows. The air smelled of soap and fresh linen. For the first time in months, Agnes exhaled fully. The days that followed were slow and gentle. Agnes slept when her body asked her to. She ate when she was hungry, not when someone allowed it. Mama Wanjiku cooked simple meals and scolded Agnes affectionately when she tried to help too much. "Your work," now Mama Wanjiku said firmly, "is to live." Dr. Otieno visited regularly, monitoring Agnes's recovery and the baby's progress. Each visit brought cautious reassurance. "You're healing," he told her one afternoon. "Both of you." Healing was not dramatic. It came quietly in small victories. The absence of pain, the return of appetite, the sound of laughter surprising Agnes when she least expected it. Simon kept his distance, but he did not disappear. He handled the legal process, methodically insisting on transparency. Witnesses from the mansion were protected. Medical records were submitted. Margaret Whitmore's lawyers attempted damage control, but Simon refused to intervene on her behalf. She must answer for what she did. He told them simply. Margaret did not fight it. She resigned from her remaining positions without public statements or excuses. When charges were formally brought, she accepted them. The image of the woman kneeling on a hospital floor haunted her every step forward. In private, Margaret began something she had never done before. She listened. Former employees came forward not to shout, but to speak. Stories of humiliation, of fear, of silence. Each one cut deeply, stripping away illusions Margaret had mistaken for strength. When she was finally permitted to request a meeting with Agnes, Simon asked Agnes first. "You don't owe her anything," he said. "This is your choice." Agnes thought about it for a long time. When the day came, Margaret arrived alone, no driver, no lawyer. She wore simple clothes, her posture subdued. She did not sit until Agnes did. "I won't ask for forgiveness," Margaret said quietly. "I know I haven't earned it." Agnes studied her carefully. "Why did you want to see me?" she asked. Margaret swallowed. "Because every day I wake up knowing I nearly destroyed my own grandchild," she said, "and because I need to face the harm I caused without excuses." Agnes nodded slowly. "I won't pretend your apology erases what happened," she said. "But I also won't let what you did define the rest of my life." Margaret bowed her head. "That is more mercy than I ever gave." The meeting ended without reconciliation, but also without hatred. For Agnes, that was enough. Months passed. Agnes's belly grew heavier, her movements slower, but her spirit lighter. She began attending counseling sessions arranged by Simon, not because she was broken, but because she deserved care. She learned to speak about fear without shame, to name pain without drowning in it. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Agnes felt the baby kick sharply. She laughed, startled. "You're strong," she murmured. Mama Wanjiku smiled from across the room. Like your mother. When labor finally began, it was not dramatic or rushed. Simon waited in the corridor, pacing silent, his hands trembling slightly. Mama Wanjiku stayed with Agnes, whispering encouragement, grounding her through each wave of pain. Hours later, a cry filled the room, clear, powerful, alive. Agnes wept openly as the nurse placed the baby on her chest. A daughter, warm, breathing, perfect. Simon entered quietly, stopping short when he saw them. His breath caught in his throat. "She's beautiful," he said softly. Agnes looked at him, exhaustion and strength intertwined. "Her name is Amara," she said. "It means grace." Simon nodded, tears shining in his eyes. "It suits her." He did not reach out immediately. When he finally did, Agnes guided his hand gently. "She will know you," Agnes said, "but she will also know who I am. That matters." "It does," Simon replied, "more than anything." As Agnes held her daughter, she felt something settle inside her, a sense of wholeness she had never known. Not because pain had vanished, but because it no longer ruled her. Weeks later, Agnes chose to speak publicly, not as a victim but as a witness. She told her story calmly, without embellishment. She spoke of silence, of fear, of power misused. She did not attack. She did not beg for sympathy. She asked only that women like her be seen. The response was overwhelming. Support poured in. Laws were questioned. Conversations shifted. Agnes was invited to help shape a foundation protecting domestic workers, a role she accepted cautiously, on her own terms. Margaret Whitmore watched from a distance, learning what it meant to be unheard. And Simon stood beside Agnes, not in front, not behind, but beside. One evening, as Agnes sat beneath a tree holding Amara, Simon joined her. "I won't pretend I can undo the past," he said, "but I want to be present for the future." Agnes looked at her daughter, then back at him. "Then be present," she said, with humility. Simon nodded, always. As night fell, Agnes felt something she had not dared to imagine. Before, hope not as a fantasy, but as a steady, earned truth. She had been beaten. She had been silenced. She had nearly lost everything. But she had survived, and now in her arms she held proof that cruelty does not have the final word.
Agnes Rotich's story is not just about cruelty exposed or power brought to its knees. It is about something far deeper and far more uncomfortable. It reminds us that violence does not always come with fists at first. Sometimes it begins with silence, with people looking away, with rules that value order more than humanity, reputation, more than life. Agnes was not weak because she endured. She was strong because she survived in a world that taught her she did not matter. Her silence was not consent, it was fear. And fear is often the language forced upon the powerless. This story asks us to question how many times we have mistaken obedience for character, silence for peace, and authority for righteousness. Margaret Whitmore believed control was strength. She believed discipline justified harm. But true strength was never in her raised hand, it was in Agnes's refusal to let pain turn her heart into hatred. Justice in this story did not arrive as revenge. It arrived as truth, as accountability, as the courage to name wrongdoing, even when it came from the most powerful place in the room. Simon's journey teaches us another lesson: walking away from injustice does not absolve us from it. Silence, even well-intentioned silence, allows harm to grow. Responsibility begins the moment we choose to stop looking away, even when that means confronting our own family, our own comfort, our own past. And then there is Amara, life born out of violence, yet untouched by it. She represents hope that is not naive but earned. Hope that says, what happened to me will not define what happens through me. Healing does not mean forgetting. It means choosing to build something better with the truth we now hold. If this story moved you, ask yourself one quiet question. Where in my life have I stayed silent when someone needed to be seen? Your answer matters. Now I'd love to hear from you.
What part of Agnes's journey touched you the most? Do you believe justice can heal, not just punish? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice may be the one someone else needs to read today. And if stories of courage, truth, and unexpected hope speak to your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and stay with us. More stories are coming, and every one of them begins with listening. Thank you for being here.